ברוכים הבאים, שומעים? ברוכים הבאים ביום אביבי זה לשלב השלישי של פורום דוסטרובסקי במכון ון ליר. אנחנו עוסקים השנה בנושא כותרת כללית שניסחנו אותה כך: החינוך ליצירתיות במוזיקה ובמחול, ריצוי מול חיפוש, קונפורמיזם מול חופש ביטוי. במסגרת המצומצמת של פורום דוסטרובסקי שאנחנו מנהלים בעצם 400 בשנה, ניסינו יחד עם הצוות המנחה לראות כיצד אנחנו מתמקדים על מספר משנה או כיצד אנחנו מתנהלים בתוך הסבך הצפוי של עיסוק בסוגיה הזאת שיכולה להתפרש באופנים רבים ומגוונים. המושב הראשון בעצם ניהלנו אותו שהוא מושב פתיחה כללי, כדי שלא דיברנו על קומפוזיציה ולא על כוריאוגרפיה, דיברנו על רבה האוס, לדוגמה, שהיא דוגמה שהיא איזשהו רצון להתחיל משהו חדש מבלי לסחוב חבית גדולה של התניות עבר. עמוס חץ שהיה הדובר השני כיוון אל דיון שהוא לא התפתח מפאת קוצר זמן, אבל הוא כיוון אל דיון שבו מה בעצם עושים במחול כאשר נמצאים בשני הכתבים האלה, החינוך הקפדני, הקלאסי, מצד אחד הטכני, מצד שני העיסוק ההולך וגובר באלתור. במושב השני שהתקיים בפברואר התמקדנו על יוזמות או פעילויות או שהן תורות עבודה, אם אפשר לקרוא לזה ככה, או אי תורות עבודה, בפלח של מגמות התיכון בפירמידה החינוכית, כאשר באמת היו מספר דוברים מספר דוגמאות לגישות שונות והתנסויות שונות, כאשר שוב פעם בפוקוס נמצא החינוך ליצירתיות מול הצורך במינון, נגיד ככה, בתורות עבודה, במסורות, בחינוך למיומנות וכו', לעומת הרצון לפתח את התלמידים לחשיבה יוצרת, בלתי תלויה, בית, זו או אחרת. הפרדוקס הוא עתיק יומין, הוא מאוד מרתק. תוכניות לימודים מקבלות כל הזמן שינויים, אנחנו צועדים קדימה, אנחנו חוזרים אחורה, אנחנו לא נוכל כמובן גם לפתור את זה היום, ובמושב הנוכחי ביקשנו להתמקד בסוגיית הוראת הקומפוזיציה והכוריאוגרפיה בפלח האוניברסיטאי, זאת אומרת בשלבים הגבוהים של או של ההוראה או של ההתנסות בתחומים הללו. אני חושב שכל דור ודור מוצא את עצמו מתלבט, הן כאומנים, עם יוצרים שהם גם מחנכים, מורים, מסתכלים על עצמנו, איזה learning, איזה תהליך של לימוד היה לנו, איזה תהליך של unlearning היינו צריכים לעשות. זו ספירלה אינסופית. איך אנחנו רוצים או להקנות ולשכוח, או להתמודד בצורה שהיא גם רכישת ידע וגם ביקורתיות כלפי הידע הזה, בכל מה שקשור לערכי העבר. עניינים של שפה ותוכן ומה שביניהם, איזה התניות נוצרות מסוג סגנוני מובהק כזה או אחר וכולי. זה ים ענק של שאלות. אני לא רוצה להכביר במילים, אנחנו מאוד שמחים שמתאפשר לנו על ידי עזרתו של מכון ון ליר להזמין לשאת דברים פרופסור יונתן ברגר מאוניברסיטת סטנפורד, שנמצא השנה ברומא, במסגרת פרס רומא שהוא זכה בו. אז אנחנו זכינו מזה, מכיוון שאני חושב שהיה קשה להביא אותך מקליפורניה, אז נוח מאוד. ויהיו לנו שני משיבים, סרוסי, שהוא ראש המחלקה לקומפוזיציה בבית ספר בוכמן מטה, ואני מבקש להתנצל מעומק הלב בשמה של דוקטור שרי אלרון, שנפלה לי משכב והודיע לי על זה רק במוצאי שבת. היא לא יכולה, סיבות מוצדקות לגמרי, להיות איתנו כאן, וביקשתי בהתראה קצרה ביותר ממר אמיר קולבן, פרוגרף, להיות משיב בתחום הכוריאוגרפיה והוראת המחול במקומה של שרי. אני מודה קודם כל גם לג'ון שנאות להגיע, וגם כן בהתראה של מספר שבועות, לא תכננו את זה חצי שנה מראש, ראובן ולאמיר. אני רוצה להציג בפניכם את פרופסור יונתן ברגר, מלחין, חשובי המלחינים האמריקאים בדורנו, כותב אופרות, מוזיקה קאמרית, יצירות סימפוניות, קונצ'רטי, במדיומים שונים, חוקר מאוד מקורי שמקשר בין מוזיקה ותכניה השונים, הן מבחינה אקוסטית, הן מבחינת השימוש במחשבים ואמצעים אחרים, עם קשרים והקשרים רבים עם דיסציפלינות אחרות, אומנותיות ומחקריות, מדעיות. ג'ון מלמד כבר הרבה שנים באוניברסיטת סטנפורד, בין השאר עמד ועדיין ממשיך לעמוד, או שכבר לא. כבר לא עומד בראש ה-CCRNA? לא. זהו? אוקיי. אבל בכל זאת היה מראשי ה-CCRNA בסטנפורד וייצב את דרכו של המרכז החשוב הזה. אז מבלי לא נוספת, ג'ון, בבקשה.
תודה. אז תכף אני אעבור לאנגלית, ואם תרשו לי אני אקרא את רוב ההרצאה שלי, רק בגלל האמת היא שאני מאוד רגיל וגמיש ללמד קומפוזיציה, לעשות מאסטר קלאסס, לעשות הרצאות על המחקר שלי, אבל בזה שהייתי ראש מחלקה ובזה שהייתי קשור ל-curricular changes בכל שכבה, אני אף פעם לא התבקשתי לדבר על פדגוגיה וחינוך, וזה קצת זר לי, אז כתבתי משהו, אז תרשו לי. גם כן אני צריך להתנצל שהספל צ'קר שלי לא מכיר לטינית, ורק עכשיו שמתי לב שזה כתב Speculum Musicae לא נכון. גם כן אני אציין שאני פה בחבורה מאוד, זה מאוד נוגע בלב. יש מנטור שלי כמו רות קאץ, ששנים אני עוקב אחרי העבודה שלה ואנחנו בקשר, ויש קולגים שלי ויש לי סטודנטית חדשה שמגיעה אליי לסטנפורד, מאיה טוויג, אז חגיגה פה, זה נחמד, זה תמיד חגיגה בארץ. אוקיי, אז עכשיו אני אעבור לאנגלית. לא, אני אגיד עוד דבר בעברית, בגלל שאני מאלתר פה. לפני שאני אתחיל, אני רוצה פשוט, בגלל שבאתי מרומא, ואני באמצע פרויקט שנפל מהשמיים בצורה לא רגילה, ואני רק רוצה להגיד שני מילים על מה אני עושה עכשיו, לתת השראה למאיה בעיקר. אז החלק של העבודה שלי בקומפוזיציה זה לעשות מודלים של מקומות אקוסטיים. ותוך כדי ללמוד את התהליך, אני ביקשתי להיכנס לכנסיות ואתרים מרומא העתיקה וכפרות, ולעשות מודלים של התנאים האקוסטיים של המקומות האלה. איך אני עושה את זה? אני הולך ומפוצץ בלון ומקליט את זה עם כמה מיקרופונים, ואז יש לנו תוכניות במחשב לעשות, לראות מה ה-delay times ומה ה-return times, וגורם שאנחנו קוראים near echo density, זה הכמות של graininess בסאונד שבא מהאקוסטיקה, ואנחנו בזמן האחרון אנחנו מערבבים את זה עם טכניקה שנקרא photogrammetry, שאנחנו עושים עם אדריכל, אני עובד ואנחנו לוקחים high definition photographs, ואז אנחנו בונים virtual three-dimensional space, שאנחנו משווים ל-three-dimensional acoustic model. אז זה המשחק שאני עושה. זה לא חשוב. אחד מהמקומות שאני נפלתי עליו זה כנסייה קטנה ברומא, במוזיאון שנקרא פלאצו אל טמפס, ואם אתם תגיעו לרומא, לא להפסיד, לא לפספס את המוזיאון הזה. אף אחד, תיירים לא הולכים לשם. זה פנינה של מקום, זה אוסף של פיסול רומאי בתוך פלאצו מהרנסנס, וב-1600, ואני לא אכנס לכל הסיפור, ב-1604 בדיוק, בנו כנסייה קטנה. כנסייה מדהימה, ואנחנו יודעים שהכנסייה הזו לא השתנתה מבחינת אדריכלית מאז. זה בדיוק מה שהיה אז. נוסף לזה, יש שם אוסף של פארט בוקס שנכתבו, שהמוזיקה נכתבה למקום. חלק של המכינים הם מכינים ידועים כמו פליצ'ה נריו, אבל אחד מהמכינים הוא היה חובבן, זה היה על טמפס בעצמו, הבעל המקום שהוא היה כותב מוזיקה, והמוזיקה שלו די יפה. אז כדי, אני לא אכנס לזה הרבה, אבל זה, אנחנו שומעים את זה מפה? כן? אז זה יצירה, זה סינתזה של יצירה של טמפס כתב, וזה יבש, והנה איך שזה נשמע בתוך הכנסייה הזו. ואנחנו יודעים די בוודאות שאנחנו יכולים לשחזר את האקוסטיקה של המקום. עכשיו, בזמן שאנחנו עושים זה מה שקרה בדיוק לפני יומיים, לפני זה אני מתלהב. בזמן שאנחנו עושים את הפוטוגרמטרי, אני נכנס לפינות של הכנסייה שאף פעם לא שמתי לב. ויש שם פרסקו, זה חלק קטן של פרסקו, והפרסקו הזה, הקהל לא רואה את זה בכלל. זה מאחורי הבימה. אז אנשים לא רואים את זה. ויש פרט בפרסקו הזה, שמישהו זמרים ששרים. אז אני לקחתי את הצילום הזה, והסתכלתי, ורק אתמול גיליתי שזה קנון. וכולו. אז זה מתנה מרומא. אוקיי, עכשיו אני אעבור לאנגלית ואתחיל את ההרצאה. So today I'm going to divide my talk into three sections. First I'll offer some broad comments on culture as it affects pedagogy. Second, a very brief outline on the impact of technology on pedagogy. And finally, some thoughts about theory and practice. I'm going to talk about music specifically, but I think everything I say has direct relevance to any of the arts. I'd like to start with a short excerpt of a work by Charlie Strolling, a doctoral student at Stanford who studies composition with me. I pose this example for context, and I'm not going to say anything more about it other than to ask you to imagine what might occur in a composition lesson and what you might do with him if you were his composition teacher. Michal Morakon's 2009 account of the history of music education in Israel depicts faculty dissent at what was then the 10-year-old Palestine Academy of Music in Jerusalem. The rebellion, as Kohn described it, was led by Yocheved Ostrovsky, who subsequently created and directed the new academy in Jerusalem for the next 30 years. Thus, it seems appropriate to start a conversation about the current era of rebellion in arts pedagogy in this symposium honoring Ostrovsky's memory. For many of us, myself included, Ostrovsky's academy formulated the core of what we are today. The faculty, primarily a combination of seasoned European immigrants and new Russian immigrants, each in their own way, sought to create a voice that reflected their adopted home while maintaining a grasp on the aesthetic underpinnings of their origins. Pedagogical training was firmly rooted in the past, while exploration and adaptation of new sonic materials and techniques were encouraged. Few of we students questioned the relevance of what we learned or the methodologies we used to teach. And although we have all developed independent voices, those roots remain evident. And I suspect the way we teach retains a good deal of the way we were taught. Yet a revolution is afoot in music pedagogy, and we would be severely remiss not to confront it. A few years back, in a noble attempt to set ethical standards, this very forum produced a working document on the ethics of teaching music and dance, one of the dangers of putting everything online. It called for a balance between providing professional tools and encouraging independence, as stated here in item 20. I want you to look at item 20 for a minute. The statement is fascinating in a number of respects. For one thing, it suggests that our task as educators is to stimulate curiosity rather than to support curiosity. It's almost as if students arrive with no curiosity, and it's our task as teachers to create it. Beyond that, it seems that the job of the teacher is to develop the student's individualized worldview by providing professional tools. Now, if I'm not mistaken, professional tools is a euphemism for the traditional methods and techniques that we have inherited and to which we cling. Certainly, we hold on to some of these tools more tightly than others. I'm guessing for us composers that few of us continue to teach combinatorial properties of the tone row. Many have ceased teaching species counterpoint, while teaching functional tonal harmony remains virtually ubiquitous throughout the academic curricula. We hold on tightly to what we consider core values of music: recurrence, variation, development, structure, structural integrity, and these all remain entrenched in a musical universe that's primarily premised on pitch and rhythm. However, an increasing number of young people are approaching the academy having created sonic objects that do not necessarily fit within these parameters. These sound objects have a number of manifestations, and I think can be explained by a number of conditions that were unanticipated and, for most of us, myself included, unimaginable until recently. Despite the bold new sounds they create, these young people, for one reason or another, feel that we can serve their educational and developmental needs, and so they apply to our schools. As resistant as one might be, it is unavoidable to face these intrusions into our comfort zone. So before we proceed, let's stop and imagine collectively how we would address these issues and how we would create a curriculum that would fit that. So imagine we're a faculty debating this topic. One of us, perhaps the rebellious Ostrovsky amongst us, sees an opportunity for change. So she gets up and she writes on the following on the blackboard. Students should choose whatever course they feel is relevant to them, period. What? I protest. How does a student know what is important? We're opening a Pandora's box. And what if the student says that she sees no reason to learn functional harmony? There will be no specific requirements. Well, to those of us whose pedagogical staple is to teach such things as functional harmony, this likely seems like a shocking idea. Our hypothetical extremist colleague has proposed to allow the granting of an academic title of artist or of art scholar with no preconditions. Surely everyone should have a common orientation. Really? No prerequisites? Well, okay, she writes, maybe 2 prerequisites. And what will those be? She thinks about it for a moment, and then she gets up and said, how about this? A course called Thinking About Music and a course called Critical Listening. And each of these courses will be 1 semester long. That's it. From there on, students are on their own to shape. That's it? Yeah, that's it. Okay, so before we go on, let me ask you that, let's just take a vote by hands. How many of you would be excited by this idea and willing to support it? And how many would you be against this idea and not willing to support it? So I would say it's about, well, 60% are innovative, willing to support it, and 30% not. That's pretty good. So, so it turns out this is actually not a hypothetical thought exercise. These discussions are occurring in a number of places, particularly in the United States. Just last week, Harvard University made their new curriculum public. You can go online and see it, but I'll give you a summary of it. Here it is. Let's read this together. Students are free to choose from a wide range of introductory and advanced courses, choose pathways that reflect their musical interests and aspirations. We enable students to enroll in courses but do not require them to follow a particular route. The goal is to build flexibility into the curriculum, making it possible for students with diverse backgrounds and interests to flourish as a music major. So this is exactly verbatim what we just voted upon. And this is what the faculty at Harvard decided to do. And yes, there are 2 required courses. And lo and behold, those 2 required courses are 1 semester thinking about music and 1 semester called critical listening. And I'm not sure yet what happens in those semesters. Harvard rationalizes the change as being responsive to the realities of a changing world. Boundaries are blurring, they claim. Students are more diverse. The range of students' interests are broader today than ever before. Of course, by necessity, when you add breadth and diversity, it comes at the expense of depth. And here lies one of the big problems, and I think this is the crux of the discussion that ends up happening, but it never comes to the fore. And so this is something I would like to, I'm just going to pass over it now, but I think it's something to come back to. A similar, albeit less dramatic, revision of music curriculum was just implemented by Cornell this past year. Nami and I were talking before, and Brown has something that approaches that. There's a trend in the United States that is going towards a very new type of curriculum with very different types of requirements. And I think it's time that we think about what it is we're producing and where it is going. And when I say that, I'm not posing, I'm confused. I don't have a clear opinion on this, but I think we need to understand and talk about it. So while curricular revisions may be implemented periodically, radical shifts like this happen rarely and always with profound effects and resounding implications. What will music pedagogy be when there is no common core? Presumably, the graduates of these programs will replace us and arts pedagogy. Indeed, art as we know it will wither and die in much the way that philosopher Arthur Danto predicted. This is one of my favorite quotes from Arthur Danto, whose book, The End of Art, is very much worth reading. He writes, "In our narrative, at first only mimesis was art, then several things were art, but each tried to extinguish its competitors. And then finally, it became apparent that there were no stylistic or philosophical constraints. There is no special way works of art have to be, and that is the present, and I should say, the final moment in the master narrative. It is the end of the story." So, radical changes like these are predicated upon a resistance to current authoritative norms and a rejection of the presumption that there exists a fundamental core of knowledge that is necessary to produce works of artistic and aesthetic value. And yet the very nature of great art involves challenging assumptions. On rare occasions, new ways of conceiving musical structure demanded entirely new concepts of representation. The constraints and notational limitations of the 13th century were not sufficient for the rebels whose interest in new complexity and new modes of organization demanded entirely new means of notation. The call for a new art was met with objection and derision, as evident in Jacobus of Liège's response to the Ars Nova, with the radical aesthetic shift represented by the advancement of this new set of notational conventions, with a radical impact on the future of music and implications for music pedagogy evident today. And Jacobus wrote, "If only they would pursue the proper and noble music and not drag musica practica beyond its limits." So here's a wall that's hit right? And the Ars Nova into the Ars Antiqua into the Ars Nova is sort of a watershed moment, and I'm arguing that we're actually facing this very same type of moment with some alternatives. So, so now I'm going to play my second student piece. This is a piece by it says one, but I changed the order this morning. This is a piece by a student, Andrew Greenwald, who recently finished his doctorate. It's called A Thing is a Whole. So a few years ago, one of my graduate students presented this score for string quartet using a complex system of tablature rather than traditional notation. Every detail of how and where the bow was to touch the string, and how and where fingers were to be situated on the fingerboard was encapsulated. The score was entirely incomprehensible to me, and my first reaction, very similar to Jacobus of Liège, was if you would only pursue proper music and not drag notation beyond its limits. But Andrew had a sound ideal that was specific and found the only way possible to realize the sound. Pitch, musical interval, melody, harmony, counterpoint, and all common music notation practices were entirely irrelevant to this music. I'm going to play the opening. What you'll see is an incomprehensible score, and you'll see in groups, it starts with a string with the upper strings playing, so each group is a string, and the cello comes in on the next page. Oops, sorry. Here's the instructions, how to read the score. Entrance of the cello. Andrew's music represents a new art. It challenges core assumptions that I hold dear. And like the innovations of the Ars Nova, the tools at hand were insufficient for the artist, and the notion that traditional systems and my antiquated notions of music pedagogy could provide the tools he needed was pretentious. However, these pretenses stretch far beyond issues of notation and representation. In 1909, Harvard University published a series titled The Harvard Classics. It comprised the great books of the Western world. In the 1930s, discussions among American academics and educators, led by John Erskine of Columbia University, focused on improving higher education by returning it to the Western liberal arts tradition of broad, cross-disciplinary learning. The view among them was that the emphasis on narrow specialization in American colleges had harmed the quality of higher education by failing to expose students to the important products of Western civilization and thought. This list, with very little variation, became the standard freshman requirement in American universities and remained so until the late 1980s, when students challenged the presumption that these authors, all Caucasian, all male, represented all vital knowledge. They objected to being bound to a single core and rejected the arrogant presumption of the superiority of male-dominated Western civilization as embodied in a select group of thinkers. To summarize thus far, the crisis in pedagogy is analogous to the radical aesthetic shift of the Ars Nova, fueled by a disavowal of the privileged dominance of Western culture. Today's Ars Nova, or more correctly, the plural Novus Artis, is forcing us not only to reconsider the core, but to consider the notion that there actually may not be a single core. So now I'm going to say a few words about the role of technology in all of this, because up until here, I think what I'm saying is we've seen this before. We haven't paid a whole lot of attention to it in terms of curricular organization, but we can anticipate that that this has happened or this would happen. We can't anticipate to the extreme, but it's something that we can deal with. And the added inference is that in the revolt against the Western hegemony of being a male, white-oriented society, this issue of diversity now poses all sorts of new questions to the academy. And again, I'm not giving an opinion here, I'm just stating the case that it's a problem. So now let's look a bit at the role of technology in all of this. So technologies have always been influential in the arts. Every instrument changes as a technological change that changes as a result of a need of a composer or the need of an acoustic space, or vice versa. Some instrument maker comes up with this newfangled idea and makes this new instrument, and then composers turn around and look at it, like Mozart, who took the clarinet and turned it over and then wrote music that could not be imagined by anyone else as wonderful as it is for this newfangled instrument. So technologies have triggered fundamental changes in both the production and reception of the arts, but more so over the past century. And it's useful to consider these effects with a broad stroke in considering the current crisis of pedagogy. While the arts have always had a mutually influential relationship with technology, the most profound by far dates back to the early 20th century and the advent of recording. More recently, technologies that facilitate immersion and interactivity are supplanting passive recording. Furthermore, new products and methods make music engagement readily available and democratically distributed. The advent of recording at the turn of the 20th century changed the way music was heard and perceived. The collective attention span soon became reduced to 3 minutes, the amount of music that could fit on a single wax cylinder. We became used to hearing music without engaging in it, and we were subject to music virtually all the time. Collectively inundated by sound, we became a society of inattentive, impatient listeners. The detachment created by recorded music was countered recently by a wave of immersive and interactive technologies. Virtual reality, gaming worlds that have alternate narratives, opportunities for distributive musical interaction over networks, and tools that simplify the creation and manipulation of sound have become routine and offer opportunities for collaboration and individual exploration and invite broad inclusion. Music has become increasingly ubiquitous and instantly accessible, and new performance tools provide for anyone with a cell phone and an internet connection to create and collaborate in music performance and composition. While these tools offer a great deal of sophistication and complexity to any user, there is a lowest common denominator of collaboration, which has become repetitive, looping metric units produced effortlessly and instantly. And if there's one thing that I'm giving my opinion on, it's the danger of looped music and its effect on the world of musicians that are coming into play today. So these technologies are all factors in the types of students that we encounter. Beyond Andrew's need for a new notation system, it is important to consider the limitations in transcribing and describing music within the framework of the status quo. Most theory curricula are dominated by the assumption that to be defined as music, a work must be describable with available tools. As a result, we teach but a few theoretical approaches, mostly pitch-based, harmony-based, rhythm-based. Is it arrogant and narrow-minded to presume that our extent theories are sufficient and that what doesn't fit into this framework remain outside the boundaries of pedagogy? Methods are being developed to represent the vast amount of musical sound that has no notation system, and research in automatic transcription at my lab has advanced significantly in the past year. Andrew's music does not lend itself to any traditional analytical method, but beyond this experimentalism, the reality is that the vast majority of music in the world cannot be represented by Western common notation. Jonathan Kramer observed that music that lends itself to analysis tends to be analyzed in universities more readily than that which is not. And the music which is most often analyzed is the music that students are expected to think as the most significant and most important. But what of all the music that defies traditional analysis? Beyond that, even in the context of traditional music, what is generally most exciting about music often defies conventional analysis. That's why it's exciting. So their theory, we must remind ourselves, follows practice. And we need to seek and devise new representations to formulate new theories. For one example only, my student, I'm putting this here because Maya's here and I'm trying to push her into thinking about what to do next. My students are integrating brainwave responses with massive social media data to develop tools to measure and represent how listeners engage with music. Essentially, a notation of listening rather than a notation of producing. So my last example today, when I was still teaching at Yale, György Ligeti visited the school. This was many years ago. By chance, I was at the time teaching a composition seminar and at the same time a course in computer programming for algorithmic music composition. One student, today himself an esteemed professor of composition, took both of my classes. We happened to have been analyzing the first piece from book 1 of the Ligeti's Piano Etudes and Seminar, a work that is, with the exception of a single event, strictly procedural. Together we decided to code the etude using the Lisp programming language, and we reproduced the work with about 5 or 6 lines of computer code. It was a wonderful example of a superbly elegant musical algorithm and a superbly elegant computer language and a bright student to encapsulate the composer's thought process. So when I went to lunch with Ligeti that day, I showed him this short program, and he stared at it for a long time. And then he just burst into this beautiful, very memorable smile. Because although he did not know Lisp and he had never learned programming, he was able to decipher the code and marveled at the concise, almost poetic representation of what took him notebooks and notebooks and notebooks of sketching to do. A final point before I conclude. If I had to summarize the 3 most common critiques I make to my composition students, they would include something along these lines. The timing of your work is strange and incongruous. You do things, you get to places too early, you leave places too late. The materials are not right. The contrast is wrong. They're not highly contrasting enough, or they're overly contrasting. There's something about the way these things are fitting together. Or there's an illogic to the way things are happening. The process and procedure is illogical. These are sort of the common, those are the 3 biggest critiques I give students overall, right? And then it occurred to me, while I'm writing this down, that as I'm analyzing any minuet by Haydn, what are the 3 most important things that I always come up with? The timing is incongruous, the progressions are often wonderfully illogical, and the material doesn't contrast in a way that you would ever expect a minuet to contrast. And that's what makes what Hans Keller called Haydn minuets, he called them anti-minuets, because they do everything that the minuet is not supposed to do, right? And so we have to keep this in mind as we're teaching both composition and theory, that they have to mingle in ways that aren't always. I'm sort of critiquing myself because I live in these 2 worlds, and sometimes I don't realize that I'm saying the same things once critically and once marvelingly. In today's political climate, both in the United States and here in Israel, what we do and who we are is seen as inconsequential to many and irrelevant to some, traitorous to others, and unpatriotic to still others. Numbers of students seeking professional training in the arts are dwindling, along with students in all of the humanities. And perhaps this is good, since professional opportunities for our performers are increasingly scarce. And so it may seem out of place that I intentionally ignore these issues and instead focus on issues of, as the Dostrovsky document that I quoted from called it, the ethics of art pedagogy. The 2 big questions are, should we adhere to the notion of the supremacy and privileged position of Western art as the basis for what we teach? And given the increasingly diverse talents and needs of our students, are we to design unique curricula and requirements to fit each individual student? We've seen some small revolutions in pedagogy. In 1945, a student caught playing jazz at the Eastman School of Music was liable for expulsion. A relatively short time later, a jazz major was instituted at Eastman. And today, Eastman's Department of Jazz Studies and Contemporary Media integrates technology and improvisation with both undergraduate and graduate degree programs. I just want to end with the graduate degree program piece of it, because this takes us up a slightly different alley. One might ask, why offer a graduate degree in jazz, or a graduate degree in music, or a graduate degree in composition, or a graduate degree in music in general? There's a sense today that everyone now needs a doctorate. In fact, a graduate degree is seen as the minimum criteria for advancement. But when the minimum degree is the same as the terminal degree, how do we qualify excellence and achievement? Our academic arts programs often focus on students who expect a graduate degree as the default requirement, a ticket to advancement, an entry to the cabal of teachers. We are teachers producing teachers, producing teachers, producing teachers. And at the same time, we are increasingly admitting students with unique skill sets, like Andrew's, that fall outside what we consider the fundamental pedagogical core. We're producing new artists who actually may lack the ability and certainly the desire to perpetuate that core. We've come to a hugely problematic moment, and so I've raised many questions but offer no real answers. I do offer one cautionary note. While I admire the forum's summary document on the ethics of teaching music and dance, I'm afraid the very framing of the statement is self-defeating. Students are reflecting a new world order, or perhaps more precisely, a new world disorder. And it is vital that we discuss how to adapt it. Before I end, let me just go back to these two pieces, the end of the Ars Nova, the end of the Ars Antiqua and the beginning of the Ars Nova. Radical changes like these are predicated upon a resistance to current authoritative norms and rejection of the presumption that there is a fundamental core of knowledge. I'm repeating what I said before. The very nature of great art involves challenging these assumptions. And just to keep it in our ear, let's hear a piece, the beginning of a piece by Perrotin. And the beginning of a piece attributed to De Vitry, which challenged, which needed a new notation system, and hence the wall that was created in the Ars Nova. So as I listen to this with the ears of my student Andrew, I see myself as facing this new music in a very same way. I mean, I can only imagine that those that resisted the Ars Nova were hearing this piece exactly as I hear Andrew's string quartet. Thank you.